When I lived in Guatemala, Amy, we had floods one time that were so deep in the city streets that, I drove a truck there, and the waters went all the way to the top of the wheels of the truck. And when I would turn a corner, the water would come in underneath the truck itself. And I tried to drive to my job teaching English at the university. And of course, nobody was out. The lower floor of the university had been flooded, and we had to just shut down everything. And we were actually pretty lucky because we were high in the mountains, and the folks who lived on the slopes of the mountains were the victims of landslides. They lost their homes, they lost the roads that they traveled on, and some people lost their lives. The World Risk Index has ranked Guatemala 4th globally in terms of risk of becoming a disaster victim due to an extreme natural event.
Wow, Holland, and you lived there for 3 years, right?
Yes.
Wow, okay. Well, I'm glad you were safe. Thanks for sharing that story. Well, I remember as a child observing Hurricane Agnes in 1972. No one else needs to be doing math right now. Seeing the floods in my own community. Thankfully, no one in my family was hurt, but many others were. And while many of our listeners may not have had to relocate as a result of a natural disaster, the trend is becoming more and more common. So today we're going to be talking about climate migration and the stories of those who are researching this trend and experiencing it.
Hi, I'm Holland Webb.
Hi, I'm Amy Boland.
And you're listening to The Afterword, a conversation about the future of words.
So joining us at the Afterword table tonight is Dr. Elizabeth Fussell, who is an author, professor, and researcher at Brown University. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Did we get your last name right?
Yeah, you did. I was super impressed.
Yay! Well done, you, Holland. That's what that literacy and phonics skills comes into play. Very good. Well, again, we are just so grateful to have our experts at the table. And tonight we are pleased to welcome Dr. Robert Oakes. He's the senior researcher at United Nations Institute for Environment and Human Security. So welcome to both of you.
Much great to be here.
Both of you have personal stories that lie behind what you do. So in just 60 seconds each, would you mind sharing the Cliff Notes version of your life and who you are, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I am a professor of population studies and environment and society at Brown University. And I started studying disasters and migration when I was a professor at Tulane University. My research specialization was migration, and mainly international migration from Mexico to the United States. But when Hurricane Katrina hit, I saw the whole population of the city set into motion, and it made me apply those skills and theories about migration to what I was observing around me. And so that is how I came to this subject.
Thank you for sharing. Rob?
Yeah, I guess I have a story that links some of those ideas. So as a kid, I was also really fascinated by extremes and disasters. And I do remember there was a so-called hurricane, which we experienced in the UK. And, we live a sheltered existence in terms of weather and disasters. But actually, this was a bit of a strong impact. My dad's car got destroyed by a tree that got blown over. My neighbor's roof got blown off, and it really kind of impacted on me as a child. And later on at university, I actually studied history, but after graduating, I traveled a bit, and I was living in South America, and I sort of became more aware of the environmental processes and challenges. So I came back to the UK and studied environment and development, and eventually a PhD in disasters. And now I'm a senior researcher at the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security, where we look into the reasons for and impacts of environmental migration.
Wow. This is a pretty exciting topic because honestly, Holland, I don't know about you, but I really don't know enough. I don't know about this as much. I mean, I guess on a basic level, I would understand why someone would need to move because of weather-related issues and climate migration. But this is a kind of a new topic that we're hearing in the news. And so I need to have a little bit more education. And so both of you, Beth and Rob, if you will just lightning round, we're going to throw some terms out at you. Doesn't matter who takes it. You can play off each other. Or if it's just not a word that we need to even hit tonight, just we can skip it. So the first one I'm going to toss to you all is environmental degradation. Help us out.
So this would be the decline in the quality of the environment or the services that the environment provides. So it could be in terms of the productivity of land, of soil, or it could be about the quality or the contamination of water. And when this interacts and is caused by climate change, we have some real pressures on populations and their livelihoods.
Okay. Beth, got anything else to add to that?
I'm going to let Rob, environmental degradation expert.
Okay. How about, I bet, Beth, you're going to take this one. Population displacement.
Yeah, population displacement is what we say when we are referring to people who have been displaced because of environmental degradation. And it can happen in a number of ways. It could be, as Rob said, that people's livelihoods are degraded through environmental degradation. And so, like, if they're agricultural workers or farmers and they just simply can't grow enough or produce enough of their crop to make a living, that's one way in which people might be displaced. But we probably think of this as more dramatically as when an extreme weather event happens and destroys the built environment. And so, for example, in New Orleans, when Hurricane Katrina caused the levees that protected the city to fail, 80% of that bowl that is the city of New Orleans filled up with water, and the pumping system wasn't able to pump the water out in time. And so the water just filled up. And about 80% of houses were flooded, and some of them all the way up to the rooftops. So obviously, people weren't able to live in the city for quite a while after that because of just scale of destruction of housing and the urban infrastructure. So there are any number of kind of changes in the natural and built environment that can cause a place to become uninhabitable and people will be forced to move. And that is a fairly rare event. It's a variety of migration, but it's by no means the only reason why people migrate.
Okay. Anything else to add to that, Rob?
Yeah, I think Beth did a great job. I'd just say in terms of displacement, there's annual figures that are produced by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, which is run out of Geneva. And they've been running for about 10 years. And typically what they find is that about 25 people are newly displaced by environmental processes each year. And this number is actually always bigger than the number of people who are displaced by conflict and violence. So this is sometimes a bit of a shock to people because the impacts of these displacements might be different. It might be more serious in terms of conflict, but the sheer weight of numbers is always higher for environmental displacement.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And you said this is from Geneva?
Yes, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center produces the best statistics for this every year.
Wow. Who even knew there was such a thing? An organization that counted that. I mean, I mean, that's just kind of sad, honestly, that we have a separate organization that counts those numbers.
Sure, but I think this field has really taken off within academia, within research institutes the last 20 or 30 years. So luckily there is a lot of work and a lot of data being produced these days.
Good. Okay. All right. So I think I understand slow onset natural disaster versus sudden onset weather event. What do you think?
Maybe I could start. So the sudden onset weather events neatly link into what we've just been discussing about population displacement. So people tend to be displaced by these quick or sudden events, such as they're mainly related to water, floods, storms, hurricanes, cyclones, but also increasingly wildfires will make people move. So these are events that you may only have a day or two to prepare, or only an hour or two, or have no warning, and then you are forced to move. Then you have the slow onset disasters, are processes which occur over a longer period of time. So it could be months or even years or even decades. So I mentioned earlier the quality of soil. So if and when there's changes in rainfalls or a period of droughts or a period of dry weather, which we see in areas of the Sahel in woods, mean that it's more difficult to grow crops and more difficult for farmers to find water for their cattle, for example, and they may be moving to a different region in search of water or a place where they can grow their crops, for example.
Wow. That's a lot. That's a great way to look at it. So the slow versus sudden. Beth, any other insight on that?
Yeah, I think that, we think of, so time is obviously the key distinction in those two types of events. And I'd just like to add another dimension of time, which is that in many cases, a set of sudden onset weather events, it may be that, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, where there's a hurricane season that lasts for 6 months of every year, it's not just that there's a sudden onset of a single weather event, but that there's a cumulative effect of repeated events of the same type or possibly different types. And so there's a cumulative nature actually to both of these kinds of disasters.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I remember when I lived in South Florida and, hearing the prediction of how many hurricanes were coming. And, at some point the accumulation, they're just exhausted. All right.
You can also have an interplay of slow onset and sudden onset. So sea level rise is maybe the kind of most infamous climate change. So if the sea level is higher, if and when there's actually a storm or a hurricane, the amount of water that's pushed up onto the land is actually higher and the impact. So these things are interacting.
Yeah, that makes a perfect sense. I'm interested in this next one about planned relocation, because to me that taps right into what you were saying, Rob and Elizabeth, about timing and, that kind of thing. So what are we talking about with planned relocation?
Well, planned relocation has been referred to as managed retreat, and it mainly relates to, managed retreat relates to sea level rise, but planned relocation is a more general form that could be in any place that it might be implemented in any place that experiences repeated hazard events. So in the United States, for example, there have been a number of planned relocations of entire communities due to riverine flooding, where people in a river floodplain have decided collectively that they were going to accept a government buyout, a federal government buyout, and relocate to a place outside of the floodplain. And that's, and it's a very effective way of taking people out of harm's way. It's also extremely costly and involves a lot of political capital in the sense that you have to get everybody in the community to agree to the plan. And that's not always easy because people don't like to leave behind their communities in the places where they've lived, often for multiple generations. But so planned relocation is that process of negotiated and typically government-sponsored relocation of households and communities. There are also individual buyout programs that the federal government has, where they will offer individual homeowners the opportunity to sell their house if it's been repeatedly exposed to flooding, typically flooding. And homeowners can opt in, but that kind of individual level plan would not necessarily move everyone out of harm's way or remove a county or cities or responsibility for providing services to the people who remain in that repeat hazard area. So the idea of planned relocation and managed retreat is more a plan that focuses on, or the sort of policy that focuses on moving entire communities in order to be effective.
Okay. Rob, is that something that you can speak to a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize, as Beth mentioned, this kind of the difficulty in satisfying everyone. Of course, you can't satisfy everyone, but there's social, economic, environmental, political, cultural challenges of moving people. And it has to be a participatory process whereby everyone's able to kind of be invested in and have some power and be able to decide if they want to move and how they move. And if that is done according to best practices, then, it can be successful. But it's also, until now, it's pretty difficult to know if these moves have been successful, because, you can't really judge after a year or two. You have to judge after a generation or two. So I think lots of good work is being done, especially in the US and in other countries in the Pacific. This is happening also, but there's lots to be learned.
Okay. Well, I'm going to kind of combine these last two terms, desertification and resource scarcity, because they kind of go together in my brain. And I know I did not pronounce that right. So help me out, Beth.
All right. Well, desertification is the process by which land that might be arable becomes infertile, or too dry to grow anything. And so this is happening particularly in equatorial regions of the world, where there may already be dry climates, but there's simply, through the warming of the atmosphere, there's an intensification of a process where those lands, those deserts, aren't getting the same level of precipitation that they have in the past, and experiencing longer periods of dryness. So that obviously can contribute to resource scarcity. That is one way in which resource scarcity happens. I would want to point out that resource scarcity can also happen through other more social and economic processes, where there's resources that may be transferred or moved around the globe, stop being moved around the globe as efficiently for, we've all been seeing supply chain problems. And, it's another kind of supply chain problem with that could produce resource scarcity in a particular community. If they can't get that if, let's say, people in a remote place can't get access to a critical commodity, they would go elsewhere to find it. And so that's that kind of resource scarcity can contribute to climate-related movements if the reason for the resource scarcity sort of has a root cause in environmental change.
I'm glad you brought up the social and economic piece too. That makes a lot of sense. Anything else to add to that, Rob?
Yeah, maybe I just sort of build upon this kind of idea of scarcity, it's not really a neutral scientific idea. I mean, something's only scarce depending on who's using it, the amount of population using it and how they're using it and the kind of development paradigm that we're within. And within that, I suppose I'd add that resource scarcity can, at the local level, it's how resources are managed as well. So quite often we think about Africa as being water scarce, and some of this is because of desertification and changes in rainfall, but also at the kind of the level, the way in which the river is managed. Water might be taken out or abstracted to use for big agriculture, for example, and the small farmer might not have access to water. So it's definitely related to the environment and climate change, and this can have knock-on influences on migration, but you need to understand, as Beth mentioned, the politics, the economics, which is interacting with this.
Boy, this is a complex subject, Colin. I'm glad that we have a little bit of an understanding with where we want to go with this conversation. Thank you both.
Well, it is a complex subject, and we've talked a little bit about how it's a contemporary subject, but really it's a very old subject, right? This is something that precedes even biblical times, especially people living in agrarian societies. For those people, following the weather was vital for survival. It's just that maybe we didn't have that specific term for people who are seeking asylum due to climate change. Can you help me understand the progression, the historical progression of climate migration?
Okay, so it's quite a broad question, but I think it's important to note, so people and societies have been moving related to the weather and climate for thousands of years. This is how various areas of the earth were actually settled or colonized 10,000 years ago. But going a little bit more recent, I mean, people have even speculated that the fall of the Roman Empire might have been related to the so-called barbarians moving around in Central Europe because of slight changes in the environment. And then getting a bit more modern, in the 20th century, the Dust Bowl in the US had people traveling around trying to find work, and desertification, meaning they couldn't actually find land to productive land to work on. But I suppose the idea of environmental migration probably took off in the late 20th century, when there's more of a focus on what is happening to the environment. And this is through certain important publications like the Population Bomb or Limits to Growth, and then also the creation of certain UN bodies which are actually looking at the environment and how we can work with the environment or within the environment. And this is interesting because at the moment, we now have migration and the environment and climate change. They're all interacting, and they're all kind of the big issues of the day. So when they do get combined, it is complex, it is nuanced, and it's something that is still, it's being tackled. But as I mentioned earlier, I suppose the academic fields maybe only going for 20 or 30 years, and there still isn't the kind of infrastructure of investment. There isn't the infrastructure of legal frameworks and political ideas to manage this. So, I mean, it's always existed, and now it's becoming a bit more concrete, and there's lots of challenges, I suppose.
So is it fair to say that this is something that was maybe localized or regionalized up until pretty recently, where it became more of a global concern?
Environmental migration is generally internal. People generally do not cross borders due to environmental change or climate change. It does happen sometimes, but if you're going to move, you normally move short distances, and you normally move within your cultural or language comfort zone. But there have been, of course, a lot of media coverage about, in Europe, the so-called Mediterranean crisis of a few years ago, of people moving from the Middle East and Africa over to Europe. So this gets higher on the agenda. But yeah, these sort of movements, the ones which are related to the environment, they have been happening for decades and centuries. It's just that sometimes the media will focus in on something which makes it seem like it's suddenly taking off.
I would just add that most environmental migration that is truly motivated by just the environment, is going to be very short distance migration within a country, unless it, in some cases of small island states where you don't have an option if there's complete inundation except to leave. But that's an exception. And that when you have migration that crosses international borders, there's usually more than just the environment that's driving it. There's a combination of factors. And so sometimes environment might be a contributing factor to international migration, but in contemporary circumstances, it's rarely the only factor. And there are political, economic, and social drivers as well that are probably more important in the long run for the reason why people would feel that they needed to leave their country of origin to survive. So we don't usually talk about environmental migration as an asylum-seeking process because that has a very political meaning. And we don't usually talk about them as refugees either if they're displaced within their country of origin. They would just be internal migrants. And in a country where everybody has the freedom to move, they're not needing to get any sort of political status.
That's a great distinction. I appreciate that. Yeah. So Beth, you mentioned a little bit earlier in your introduction about your work in that area when you were down in Tulane and Hurricane Katrina. I'm sure you have story after story, but can you share with us a story? Because again, that to me is what helps people connect to this very complex subject, is hearing the story. So can you share a story about migration and population recovery?
Yeah, well, you're right. There are so many stories to tell. And I think the stories that come to mind, I'm going to tell two, I think, that really have to do with population recovery and the fact that people, New Orleans was almost entirely depopulated when the city flooded. But today it's almost back to the same population it was before Hurricane Katrina. And not quite, but it's pretty close. And so this is more of an academic story, but I often read in journal articles that are talking about this literature. They'll say things like, New Orleans is only half the size it was before Hurricane Katrina. And this is a way in which academics fail to update their information and they prefer to tell the big disaster story and actually exaggerate the population loss or the population impact. And so it's remarkable to me how long that sort of narrative went on after Hurricane Katrina when in fact there was a steady return of New Orleans residents to the city as they were rebuilding their homes. In fact, there was a very interesting survey in the first year after Hurricane Katrina where they measured the daytime population of the city and the nighttime population of the city. And what they found is that there were a lot of people in the city during the day working on their homes, working at their jobs, but they didn't have a place to stay. So the nighttime population was much smaller than the daytime population. And I think that, that's the dynamic of population recovery that often gets overlooked because it's slow and tedious and it goes on for a long time, and journalists sort of move on to the next disaster and they don't tell that long, tedious story. And I want to tell that the second story actually has to do with this same dynamic. After Hurricane Katrina, the recovery workforce, the people who were doing the work of rebuilding the city, really was different from what the construction labor force had been before Hurricane Katrina. And so what happened is that there were a lot of people who were actually drawn to a disaster zone because of the economic opportunity that the disaster produced. So there were a lot of what I call the rapid response labor force, who were mostly Latino and other foreign-born, but some native-born construction workers who came to the city and worked in these low-wage, very difficult and dangerous jobs that were so vital to cleaning up after a disaster and getting the city working again. I could name people who I met and interviewed and who told me their life stories about how they came back to the city or why they were dedicated to continuing to live in New Orleans, even though it has the kind of risky hurricane season and depends on levees to protect it. But it really is the case that there are just so many stories that it would be hard to just choose one.
I love that, though. What a wealth of the stories, what a wealth of information that you have, that you've collected. That's wonderful. Rob, will you be able to share a story about your work, your research on migration and decision-making?
Sure, yeah. So I think it's nice what Beth mentioned previously about how decisions about migration are rarely just about the environment, right? So there's this quite well-known and more or less accepted model that says that these decisions are kind of a combination of a pentagon of political and social, economic, cultural, and environmental. And I did some research on the Pacific small island developing states of Kiribati and Tuvalu to try and find out, to dig a bit deeper what's going on when people were deciding how to react if they're faced by changes in climate. So these countries are very low-lying. So it means that they're at risk of sea level rise, but also storms, but also changes in rainfall. Access to clean water as well. So all of these things are interacting with what's happening in the countries anyway. They're poor. They're a long way from other trading nations, and so the development status is low. Anyway, when we tried to find out how people think about migration and climate change and environmental change, we found a few different ways of kind of conceptualizing this. So on the one hand, you might get people who are really ambitious and want to move to Fiji, which is, I suppose, a mini local superpower, or to Australia or New Zealand and find work, and also, maybe interact with the community from their country, with the diaspora there. And then you get others who are really concerned about what's going on with the environment. They think that it's more difficult to catch the fish, or it's more difficult to grow crops, or they're just, I suppose, their coping capacity has been eroded by all of these floods over months and years. So these people may want to leave. But on the other hand, you get some people who want to actually stay, and they may feel that their faith in gods will actually protect them from floods. And I think this is something which is also true with going back to Hurricane Katrina, and when people decide to evacuate from a hurricane or not, it may be that they think that, no, this is my home, and what comes, and I'll be protected or not, and that's life. And then you also get this kind of real affinity for home and land. And in so-called traditional societies where generations may have lived on the same land or the same home, farmed the same land, or fished the same seas, the connection with the lands can be even stronger than with people in in the global north, because everyone has a strong connection with their village or their city or their country, but it can be particularly intense in a traditional society. So in Tuvalu and Kiribati, many people just simply didn't want to move, even if they could see that, the opportunities might be better elsewhere, and actually it could be risky to stay. But because of these kind of cultural anchoring points, they might be motivated to actually stay.
I love that word, cultural anchoring points. Thank you so much.
Well, speaking of culture, Amy, thinking about that podcast episode we did last year on youth culture, millennial culture in the developing world with Mongaran Matika and Arjun Krishnalal, we talked about how there's kind of two things going on at the same time among youth around the world. We've got that global youth culture that's kind of consistent from country to country. And then we also have a sense in which many younger people are identifying with their particular location. So when climate migration happens, what's the social and economic impact on young people who are being, in a way, maybe without their own choice, maybe they still live at home, who are being uprooted and moved to a new location, even if it's near where they started?
So whenever young people move, then I suppose there's perhaps a slightly more intense set of risks. So young people are still growing physiologically, psychologically, and of course they are resilient, but the risks tend to be a little bit higher when you're young. And of course, so this could be in terms of economic and social, and with children, education is a massive factor. If you miss school because you've been displaced, or because there's a relocation scheme where the education hasn't been factored in as much as possible, then you can lose access to schooling, and this has an impact on the rest of your life. And if it's a sizable community, it can have a pretty significant impact on the society. If we think about the impact of missing schooling through COVID that has been globally, I suppose that in 10 or 20 years, society will experience some sort of negative impact from this. The cultural idea is also key. So if I go back to the idea of the Pacific, these communities in Kiribati, Tuvalu, or other small island developing states, if these people are leaving their islands, it may be that they're able to stay within their country in another island, or they have to go to another country. They are cutting off this link to a part of them, their past. As I mentioned, there's this kind of really strong connection because it's gone through the generations. And it may not be possible to access that part of their kind of cultural persona, their cultural worth. So in this case, it may be possible to connect with others and kind of explore their culture and develop their culture. It may be possible to somehow kind of return back to visit their cultural land and kind of learn from this. Or it may be that there's another way of working with a custodian of this land who can kind of bring the two together. But yeah, it's something that is underexplored, and I think not given enough attention in policy. This kind of loss of self that can come from this, and it's particularly acute if it is in planned relocation, because this could be the connection is lost forever.
I want to just pick up on this and say, I don't think that migration is the only thing about climate change that is affecting young people. And if you look at how the trends, climate trends in terms of the more frequent heat events, more frequent heavy precipitation and flooding events, all of these sorts of weather events that are extremes are happening more and more often. And when you're older, like we are, that we might observe them as being a departure from what we're used to. And that's alarming. We've grown up in a time when we felt like pretty secure and safe in our environment. And for younger people who are growing up with more frequent extreme events that seem really threatening to their lives and the lives of the people who they depend on and the environment around them, that really creates a sort of insecurity and possibly exposes young people to more early life trauma that they'll carry with them for their life. And so it's not really the migration that's the most alarming trend here, in my view. It's that feeling of just not being safe in your environment that I would worry about. And we see right now young people talking about climate grief and the way in which they worry about their futures because of how much we're seeing the manifest effects of climate change already. So I focus on that part of it, just the fact that they're growing up in a very different environment than we did, and that has sort of unknown consequence. The other thing I want to point out, getting back to the migration piece, is that when families are displaced from their homes in other words, when they're forced out of their homes and they don't choose the time at which they are migrating, that inevitably means that they're going to suffer greater losses. Because when we voluntarily move, we choose the time and the place, and we have time to gather our resources together and make a good decision about where we're going and plan where we're going to live and what jobs we're going to work at. But when you do that under a forced circumstance, you can't make any of those same decisions. And that means that the family will suffer greater losses. And it's not just a cultural loss, but resource loss. For kids, that means that, they're, like Rob said, they might lose access to their education. They might lose access to their community. But for the family system, it means that they also lost wealth. And insofar as kids benefit from inherited wealth from their elders, that means they're not going to inherit that. We know from disaster research that disasters exacerbate pre-existing inequalities. We find that over and over and over again. And so one of the things I think we'll see from climate change impacts on future generations is greater inequality, social and economic inequality. And that's something that is true regardless of whether or not people migrate.
Mm. Woo, Holland, this was a heavy, heavy topic for this episode, but it's important. It's a good conversation. We need to have these hard conversations. But I want to ask both of you, as we close out this first part of this very important conversation, what is an essential element we need to know in order to understand the stories about climate migration or, planned relocation or one of those other topics that we've kind of hit? What is the essential element we need to extrapolate from this conversation? Rob, what do you think?
I suppose linking to what Beth just said, really. So climate migration is so differentiated. There can be so many different triggers and outcomes. And so the results for the affected people can be positive or negative or neutral, I suppose. And it's important to realize that this does very closely correlate to the form of mobility. So if they are displaced, then people are likely to suffer what we call loss and damage. So within the UN climate change negotiations, this is one kind of branch of the work. Loss and damage is something that you can't adapt to. because it has negative impacts on your economic situation, or on your health, or on your access to services, or your culture, as we mentioned there. And this is more likely if you're displaced, when you have no kind of agency or limited agency about when you go, where you go, how you go. It's more risky, more dangerous. On the other hand, migration, if there is some agency involved, if you have some control, some choice, then it can be adaptive. It can be a form of adaptation. So climate change adaptation, that's another big element within the UN climate change. That's kind of, just be able to roll with it, to adapt to what's happening within climate change, and maybe even exploit the opportunity that you're presented with. So if you're moving, you may be able to use your skills and education to find a job and to be able to support yourself and your family. Generally, people don't want to move if they're obliged by the environment, but the outcomes are on a spectrum, really. I suppose this is, and it's an essential element. I mean, it's not a simple element, but it is essential to understand this kind of wide range of outcomes, really.
Yeah. And I appreciate your word agency. It sounds like that is key. Whether you have agency or don't have agency will land you on a spectrum. So Beth, what about you? What's the essential element we need to take away from tonight?
Well, I'm gonna double down on Rob's point about agency, but I'm gonna add to it by saying, migration is normal. And if we think of migration as only when we think about climate migration, we have the sort of catastrophic scenarios in mind. But I want to point out that a lot of migration for environmental reasons that we might say are due to climate change are just slightly different in form than those migrations that we take under voluntary situations. And so I think what we need to think about when we're thinking about how do we prevent those worst case scenarios, we need to think about, well, what kind of resources can we give to people so that they have more agency in their lives to migrate away from hazards under the best possible circumstances? In other words, before the catastrophe, disaster, happens. And that would be, and resources there include knowledge and having information and choices about where to go, and resources to do it. I think we really will all be better off if we have more information, understanding, and also sometimes when we think about migrants, we think of them as being the other and the people who are outsiders. And since so much of environmental migration does happen within our own national boundaries, I think we also have to think of climate migrants as us and as part of our community, so that we don't have this sort of idea that there's something to be afraid of. We have to welcome people into safer places and figure out how we can help them achieve all they can achieve, and recognize that we ourselves might be in their situation at some point. Mm-hmm. So those are all the essential elements of not understanding the problem intellectually, but understanding it as in terms of how we can solve this problem collectively.
I love that. And welcoming and not being others. That's wonderful. Thank you both so much. Alan, this was good.
It is. And while we're talking about understanding the problem intellectually, understanding the problem, I guess, empathetically or emotionally, we're going to have to put a pin in things right here, but say special thanks to Dr. Elizabeth Fussell and Dr. Rob Oakes. This conversation is critical for understanding our global community and some of the issues that we face. While you wait for part 2, please go to theafterwordpodcast.com and become a subscriber. Leave us a review and tell your friends about us. And as always, remember that you are welcome at our table.